Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers Podcast, and today we have another guest. Today we have Mark Levy. He is also known as the mold guy, and he has a business where they evaluate homes for mold exposure and help you test what's in your air quality, and help you get an understanding of what you can do to help remediate it and how this may be contributing to your chronic health issues. Off camera, before we got on, we started a discussion about mold. And mold illness is like a really kind of hot topic right now. So we're going to talk to Mark. We're going to find out what we need to know about mold toxicity, mold testing, mold exposure from his standpoint, and then we'll talk about how that might impact somebody's health and physiology. So Mark, it's good to have you on the Thyroid Answers Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on the show today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So tell everybody a little bit about who you are, what you do from a mold perspective, and where you got the moniker, the mold guy.
Yeah, so I've been doing this for about 20 years, and actually have an identical twin brother who's on the East Coast. So he's in the same business that we are. And we totally reinvented ourselves about 20 years ago. And we got into this particular industry because we saw that there was a lot of interest in really understanding a lot about the environment and how people are reacting from really more of an allergy perspective. So we saw that the mold industry was something that was actually very intriguing for us. As we got into it and the years unfolded, we started to realize that many of the people that we were dealing with were actually individuals that were having more severity in terms of their health. In other words, it wasn't just allergy type of issues. There were some people that were having more deeper type of issues, whether it be, for example, autoimmune issues or various other types of upper respiratory issues, maybe even some neurological type issues. So we ended up sitting down one day talking about how can we try to help our clients even more to understand what's going on and maybe see if their particular environment might be a trigger or something that could be impacting their health. So the American Academy of Environmental Medicine was holding a workshop on mold and toxicity and what it does to the human body. And we ended up going there, and we actually sat in this workshop, and we were amazed at the information that was being presented to us in terms of how mold and its toxins can impact the human body and what it does in terms of really creating a situation where other doctors are actually misdiagnosing what's going on. So we sat down, we started talking to the doctors, and they asked us, where do we practice our medicine? And we said, well, we're not doctors. And they go, well, what are you doing here? And so we told them about what we do, and basically told them that we're indoor air quality professionals, and what we do is that we do a very comprehensive, detailed type of investigation, a deep dive into people's homes to understand where these particular source areas might be. And then we give them optics in terms of data, lab reports that gives them an understanding of where these source areas are located, what the full impact of the home is through higher technical types of sampling methods that we do. And this is data points that gives them the ability to understand what they need to do to correct their home, but more importantly, to give them data points to share with the doctor to see if it has anything to do with the way that they're feeling.
Okay. So molds, fungi, been around for thousands of years, right? So what does the industry say as to why this has become such a big issue, such a hot topic, such a big business, both in the functional medicine space for people getting diagnosed with mold-related illness, and for companies like yours popping up? Why, if we've had mold and we live in moldy environments for hundreds, if not thousands of years, why does the industry believe that we have a bigger mold issue today? Or don't we? Or is it just that we're responding differently to it than we did a decade ago or 2 decades ago or 50 years ago?
Yeah, so think about it. What we knew back then, today we know a lot more than what we did back then, right? And so as technology and as our understanding of different environments starts to become before us, what happens is that we get to become more knowledgeable. And I will tell you this, back then when I first started in this industry, it was really more of mold is just an allergen. It's no more of an allergen. It's not making people ill. It's something that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. And why all of a sudden is it something that is actually starting to create these problems? Well, it's because now we have technology that really gives us the understanding of what's going on in their environment. We can actually uncover not just where these molds are, but the types of molds and species of molds that are there. And when you're dealing with certain species, these species actually, there's certain species that have the availability to be pathogenic or actually can even produce what we call mycotoxins. So,
but those same molds or fungi have been around. That hasn't necessarily changed. Or are you saying that the more toxic molds are more prevalent today than they were in the past? Because having the technology just allows us to see it. But is the industry saying, hey, we didn't have the level of mold exposure in the past. We have a greater exposure now, and we're able to measure it. Being able to measure it doesn't change the fact that it was or wasn't there. It just helps us identify it. But are we saying that we have more mold exposure in our environments today than we did before?
I think it's really what's gone on in the industry and the way that we built homes and the tightness of the homes that have created these homes to be more of a mold factory in terms of what it was back then to what it is today. So now you have homes that are much more tighter built. You have a lot of homes through the building boom that were built very well in terms of the quality of the build. And so you're seeing a lot of issues with homes that not only are there tightness within those homes, but there's breaches in the way that the building has been actually built that's causing quite a bit of water intrusion issues. And I think that's the big difference, is that now we're seeing more of those issues as opposed to what we were seeing back then. Homes back then were easier for them to breathe. Today, they're more tighter. They're not built as well as they were because of the amount of quickness and lack of quality. And I think that's a key indicator there.
Yeah. So that I would be more inclined with that, hey, we build homes differently. The homes are tighter. So we don't, and when we have water exposure, we hold that moisture much better in a home than we did before. And so if houses are tighter, we hold exposure better. They can stay heated up. They can provide a better environment for the homes. And I would say, as a homeowner, depending on what time you built your home and the quality of the people that were doing the work, there's a lot there. It's easy to have leaks in homes just due to workmanship. So I think that's probably an indicator. The other thing I think about, and this is, you're not in the medical in the medical space per se. Obviously, you have some background, but I think we're more chronically ill, right? And so when we have chronic illness, we already have a lot of things that are creating stress on our system, disrupted sleep patterns. We have more emotional stress, trauma, poor diet, nutrition. We're already an inflamed mess. And then we have some additional stressor like mold exposure or any organisms that we find in our heating and air conditioning units, and we're breathing that in, constantly exposed to it. We're way more susceptible to those organisms getting into the system, creating chronic health issues. At the end of the day, if it was just the organism itself, we should see like everybody sick, but it's less about the individual thing and more about the state of the individual person, much like when we see external, some people are super sensitive to allergens in the environment. Somebody else is in the same environment. They're like, I don't get stuffy runny nose. Same thing we see maybe sometimes in homes. So we've got, for multiple reasons, potentially more water damaged buildings, tighter construction, poor quality to some degree. We've got the potential for just better environments for mold growth in homes. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would tell you that it's really based upon the building structure, the way it is, the way it's maintained, the cleanliness of that particular home as well. Being able to really be aware of these moisture issues that are around your home, because a home, the building envelope, it's very important to be able to make sure that you're protecting that building envelope from any type of water infiltration, whether it's coming from the groundwater, through poor type of grading that's there. And that's a big issue, because we see quite a bit of issues where groundwater is actually making its way, seeping its way into basement areas, in the crawl space areas. And what happens is that now that becomes a breeding ground for different types of microbes to be able to proliferate and create problems within the indoor air quality. And what happens most of the time is that many people have their heating and air conditioning system in the basement. And so what that means is that now you got a basement that is actually has created these microbes that can now seep into your ventilation system and then start to distribute those throughout the home. We see that quite often. So that is one area in terms of when you're dealing with subgrade homes, that whatever you have going on in the basement, it's going to make its way up through the rest of the home, through cracks, crevices, gaps, through normal air convection, through what we call the stack effect, and leakage into your ventilation system, where that's perpetually starting to distribute these contaminants throughout.
Okay, so let's say somebody is concerned, or they want to check to find out if they have, let's use mold as a starting point. If they have mold in their home, right? Some people can go to Home Depot, Lowe's, buy these little kits that they put out and measure mold in the home. They put some of those same little, I think, Petri dishes outside and measure the mold outside, mold inside. Is that a reliable method for assessing mold in the internal environment?
No. So the first thing you want to do in terms of understanding what's going on within your home is understanding the history of your home. And so that's critically important. It's really knowing some of the events that have occurred throughout time. Sometimes you're going to be able to have that information, which could be disclosed to you. If you have a home that is many years old, through the sale of that, some people will disclose it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But then as you're living in the home, you'll be able to see certain events that have occurred along the way. Those events are really the ones that you want to pay close attention to, because when you're dealing with water issues, there's two factors that I tell people you want to look at. Number one, the category of water that you're dealing with. There's three categories of water. You have what we call clean water, which I would argue there's no such thing as clean water, which would be category one. Category two would be gray water. And then you have category three, which would be black water, which is typically a sewage loss or groundwater infiltration that's coming in from the outdoors. Those gray water as well as black water can carry different types of contaminants that can actually create triggers within the environment that can get into people's breathing zones that can actually start to disrupt their system. So at the end of the day, you want to, number one, look at where is the entry point of where the loss of the water is coming from, what type of category of water that's there. Because when you look at a water event, mold is just a byproduct of moisture. But the true primary colonizer in a water event, it's not mold, it's actually bacteria. Bacteria can grow within hours, where there's certain types of molds that could take upwards of 24 to 48 hours. So you're not just dealing with mold when it comes to these water events, you're also dealing with other microbes such as bacteria that can actually create triggers and disruption as far as your health is concerned. And what we found is that dealing with the understanding of the knowledge of the home in terms of where these particular areas of where the moisture actually originated from and then where it flowed to is the path that you really want to take a look at. So when you're taking these Petri dishes, or you may be doing air samples in the home. What happens is that these are basic tools that people can use where you have settlement of the spores that actually end up settling throughout the house. But keep in mind that what happens is, even with the plates that are there, you have to have a understanding that airflow is very dynamic. It's constantly moving, it's constantly changing. And so what you may find in one area of the home in terms of these plates is going to be different from another area, but it's not really giving you an indication of where these source areas are located. So the key thing that you want to do is that you want to identify where these mold sources are, and you do that through footprints. For example, staining, paint peeling, buckling, separation of building material are key areas that you want to highlight. And those are areas that you want to target to test to validate if there is any kind of mold that's there.
All right. So let's pause for a second so we can kind of catch up for a sec. So for the listeners, one of the reasons why we're kind of going through this is, organisms are one of the things that can trigger what we call that cell stress response, whether it's bacteria, viruses, spirochetes, parasites, whatever. So for air quality and then the environment of the home is one place where we can get exposed to these things. So we'll get more in depth into what's going on, but we want to kind of, I guess I should have started here. If somebody's not well, and this is, I do this for a living, and obviously you do this for a living, but what should clue, before we start testing a home, what should clue somebody in to the fact that they might have some air quality issues, some bacterial or mold issues in their home, to even consider getting their home checked? What would you, what might they complain of? Are you
talking about symptomatically in terms
signs
of
and
body?
symptoms? Yeah.
Yeah. I would tell you that there could be, everybody's different, as we talked about before the show, in terms of how people are going to be reacting. But when it comes to certain types of issues that we've seen, people have headaches, they end up having brain fog, they end up having fibromyalgia, aches and pains throughout the body. Certain people basically are actually, I've seen gut issues in terms of various types of issues that come about from it. So it's a myriad of different things in terms of the way people are going to actually react and what kind of symptoms that are going to be there. But if you're smelling something in your home, that's a key indicator that something's going on in your home in terms of some type of microbial growth. And the other thing is that if you had a water loss, as opposed to just basically fixing the water where it came from. In other words, if it was a pipe or you had to correct a breach, you have to deal with that building material that got saturated with that water, because it's going to end up colonizing and creating issues down the road, right? So I tell people, look, you want to listen to your body, listen to the way that you're feeling. And we have many clients that will go into their home and they're going to feel symptomatic. And then when they go away from their home, it tends to actually go away. So that's another sign, right? That if you go away, let's say you do a staycation, for an example, right? You go somewhere close to the home and you're away from your home and you're basically starting to feel a little bit better. And then you go back to your home and then you start to feel symptomatic. To me, that's a red flag. That's telling you that something's going on in your home, something's triggering you. And that's a good time for you to say, I think I need to bring somebody in to take a look at my home.
Yeah. So for the listeners, the key issue here is you could develop any signs and symptoms, because the immune system and the body itself, when it's perceiving danger signals from toxins, organisms, it's going to respond pretty similarly. It's going to release inflammatory molecules. It's going to reduce metabolism. It's going to deactivate thyroid hormone locally. It might actually initiate thyroiditis. So any signs and symptoms could be the result of exposure to organisms, anything, because the body responds to threats and stressors the same way. Definitely mucus congestion, itchy skin, headaches, all those things you said, they could be anything. And that's the thing that everybody talks about. Well, it could be anything. It could be anything, but the body typically responds with danger physiology regardless of what the threat is. The same way we I might not care if somebody was threatening me with a gun, a knife, a sword, whatever. I'm going to try and defend myself the same way, and the cells and tissues are often the same as well. So somebody doesn't feel well, they've got chronic illness, they're thinking that, hey, maybe I need to check to see if I've got heavy exposure. And I agree with you that sometimes an easy test for people is to say, I feel better when I get out of the home. Right now, it's sometimes tough, because sometimes the reason people feel better is because they're just out of their house, they're out of their normal environment, they're away from the everyday stress, and they go somewhere and they're chilling out, they're relaxing, and they're like, I'm good. But in the situation where, hey, I'm just over at my friend's house, I stayed overnight, I was better here than I was there, right? And you're not on an extended vacation where all your stress is gone. It's a shorter time frame. I would agree that then maybe there's something to consider. And also potentially the smell. The interesting thing about smells, however, is sometimes we don't know what we don't know. Somebody walks, my house doesn't smell, right? And yet, because they're in that same environment day in, day out, and that may just be the smell they're used to, right?
Yeah, they become desensitized to it, right? So that happens quite a bit as well, right? And then also, when you have that smell, it's actually the growth of mold, right? So you don't necessarily need to have an odor to know that you have a mold problem. In fact, the smell itself is called a microbial volatile organic compound, and essentially what that is, it's the digestive gases of these mold, and it's or microbial growth, whether it be mold or bacteria, and that's an indication that something is growing and proliferating within the home. But when the water goes away, that doesn't mean that the mold or the bacteria goes away. In actuality, what happens is that these microbes start to actually either die off or they are still there. And as the water continues to be dried out, they start to desiccate and they start to break down. And the further these organisms break down, it becomes a problem, because based upon the different types of species that are there, some of these species can actually produce toxins that can now be actually easier airborne, because it rides the particles of these fibers or these fragments that have been broken down, and it gets into the air, and it wafts through the air, and as it traverses and so forth, it starts to get into the system, and then ends up to actually be distributed throughout the home. So
let me jump in there, because I want to kind of keep a little sequence of events here, how we kind of walk through this. So we talked about some signs and symptoms. We talked a bit about water exposure is a huge reason for the bacterial mold growth in the home. But do we have to have a water event to have mold growth or bacterial growth in the home? Where is there other potential causes of mold or bacterial growth in somebody's home other than, hey, we had a water leak from outside, we had a water leak from the roof, pipe broke? Is there other possibilities where somebody might have increased bacterial or mold growth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it could be from the area around your home. I mean, obviously, you got to look at the area that you're in, the terrain, maybe even some of the places where you could be working could be an issue for you too. So there are a myriad of different things, right, that could actually create the feeling that that person has in terms of being symptomatic. But in reference to the home itself, certainly things around the home could actually get into the living space, and that could also be something that starts to trigger in terms of the symptoms that they have. So if there is a issue on the exterior of your home, or if there is something that's going on and you're in the path of where that is actually traveling and it can seep into your home, that certainly can impact your home as well. So a good way to look at that would be, for example, if there is a fire, right? Now you can actually see that smoke traverses through and it can end up going into other people's homes and impacting those homes that way. Certainly that could happen in certain areas where you live, where the exterior of your home is something that could be impacting it. But at the end of the day, when you talk about a home is going to have a normal microbiome. And when you think of it this way, it's a complex makeup of various types of organisms that are there in reference to their fragments as well as the toxins that are there. And so that's going to be part of where you live, the way the home is constructed, the way you live in terms of the cleanliness of it. And I would consider this to be a point that all homes have a normal microbiome. But what happens is that when you have these water events and these events start to actually grow microbes, now you have an imbalance that's created, and that imbalance starts to create a home that provides these contaminants in high levels where it can start to trigger and create symptoms.
Okay. So I know in my environment, right? And I was going to get into the home microbiome environment. So I'm glad you touched on it, because you can't escape bacteria and organisms. They're everywhere. I live in the mushroom country of Southeast Pennsylvania. So we got a lot of stuff in the air around here, but stuff's everywhere, right? But what about, I know in our environment, we've got ductwork and, HVAC units. Is there potential problems with these HVAC units, with the ductwork just getting being a place where we can get organism overgrowth?
Absolutely.
Just between the heat and cold going through the ductwork?
Absolutely. So think of it like this, right? We talked about a home as a living, breathing system through air movement, pressurization, things of that nature. When you open up the doors, you can even tell at times where, if you ever had the time where you open up a window or a door and you saw another door inside the house just shut very forcefully. Well, that gives you an idea about the types of pressurization, air movement. And that's just from normal air convection and air movement. But now when you're utilizing your HVAC system, you're also creating another form of pressure movements that's pulling in the air. And as it pulls into that air, it's going to go ahead and pull it into the system. It's going to condition it. As you get into that air handling unit, as it conditions it, whether it makes it hot or cold, there's a lot of moisture that can develop. So if you have a mold problem that's in your home, those mold spores and fragments, they end up getting into the system. They end up getting to the coil area, or maybe even the motor blower. And those are areas that we find often where there's actual types of growth of mold as well as bacteria, and that becomes a secondary source. So it's not necessarily the initial source, but it becomes a secondary source. Now, depending upon the area of the country that you're living in, if you're trying to create a temperature of 72 degrees within your home and you got all this heat that's outside, right? And you have your system that's located in the attic, which is most often, many times it's located in the attic, you're looking at temperature differentials that are actually being created. And those temperature differentials can create condensation inside these units. And actually, because of the different types of organisms that are actually traveling in there, now you have the water source, you have the temperature, and the food source, which is actually the dust. Because when you think about it, it's the dust that is the enemy. That's where all these contaminants are harbored. It's in the dust. So when we analyze the home, that's a big area that we want to look at. We want to look at the settlement. We want to see what types of organisms that are there, as well as those toxins, because that's what people are going to actually be exposed to.
Okay. So we know every home's has a microbiome, right? Is there, and we're not going to escape all the organisms in our environment. It's not possible, right? We're not walking around. We're not going to roll around our home in a bubble. So is there organisms that we consider commensal organisms that are not problematic? And is there other organisms that we consider more problematic that need to be addressed?
Yeah, absolutely. But I would say this to you, right? Any kind of mold growth in your home is not going to be appropriate, right? So the more you have, even the ones that you would call, benign or not a big deal in terms of their name, actually, if there's an overgrowth, it could actually trigger certain types of upper respiratory issues, certain type of allergen issues, things of that nature, where you're getting certain kinds of issues internally that can create inflammation. But when it comes to significant ones, there are, for example, Aspergillus species, Penicillium species. You might be familiar with Stachybotrys, which is considered to be the black toxic mold. You may also be familiar with Chitonium, which is a sister mold that I call to Stachybotrys because it's a high water content mold. And when we find Chitonium in an environment, and we may not even be picking up the Stachy, we know that Stachy is going to be there because we're finding not only the Chitonium organisms, but in many cases, we're finding the byproduct of their mycotoxin, trichothecene, which is what Stachybotrys produces. And then when they have remediation and things get disrupted, they start to see that there's Stachy that was there. But my point is that there are organisms that you want to be very much aware of that actually have the ability to be more opportunistic from the standpoint of producing these mycotoxins. And that's why we use very, what I call high-tech type of sampling methodologies. Because when people take air samples, Dr. B, what typically happens is that they take these air samples and they put them in the middle of a room, and then they compare it to these outdoor controls. And they look to see if the air samples are similar to what they're finding on the outdoors. And then if there's similarities, then they're going to say, well, you know what, that's a normal ecology. But what I would tell you is that what's happening is that when you have certain species that are indoors that are growing, and you're comparing, for example, like Aspergillus penicillium, when you are taking these spore traps that they use in these indoor investigations, there's a little slide that's there that they put on an air pump, and they would run it for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and it's pulling in the air. And as it pulls in the air, it's pulling in these fragments as well as spores. And they take that slide that's inside that spore trap and analyze it underneath a microscope called microscopy. But when you do that, you can't really differentiate between Aspergillus or penicillium, so you don't know what species that you're dealing with. So what people are doing is that they're comparing Aspergillus penicillium to their indoor counts versus their outdoor counts, but not really understanding the different species that could be there. So you could have, for example, 1,000 spore counts of Aspergillus penicillium on the outdoors, have another 1,000 in the indoor, and you're saying, hey, look, it's the same, but they could be different species. And the only way to know that is to really differentiate it. And we do that through what we call MSQ-PCR. You may or may not be familiar with ERMI. Have you ever heard of ERMI?
Yep.
Yeah, so ERMI is MSQ-PCR, and it's a DNA formatting. And that's what gives
So I think we're getting a little too technical. So let's back it up a little bit.
All right.
We've got people who are considering getting testing. What are the different testing options that are available to people? We already talked about the plates that you can get at your local hardware store. You've already said that, hey, that's not a great option. Some people may or may not have heard of ERMI testing. I think that's the one you were starting to get into. So let's explain what ERMI testing is, what that means, and what that process looks like.
Before I do that, I kind of want to step back a little bit, and I want to make sure people understand that what's really important is really identifying the history and the events that have occurred and where these water losses have originated from, because that itself is really going to be very, very telling, right? So what you want to do at the end of the day is that you want to identify where these source areas are. And the way that you do that is through these footprints, which would be, for example, staining, paint peeling, buckling, separation of building material, maybe even certain types of substances that are there. These are things that you want to look for to identify that there is a problem. And what we have learned and what we know through experience is that it's more likely than not, when you see those footprints, that you have a source that's there. Keep in mind that mold is very difficult from the standpoint that it's very inconspicuous. Most of the time you don't see it. It's behind the walls, it's in cabinets, it's under carpet, could be in your ventilation system. So by understanding where these particular source areas happen to be, those are the areas that you want to target and have those tested. And so what you do is that you can do air samples into these wall cavities that can help you identify if there are mold sources that are in there, or if you see, for example, an unusual substance that's growing, that could be sampled through a swab or a tape lift. So there's different ways that you can actually identify where these potential source areas happen to be. Now,
okay, so if somebody's saying, hey, I see little black spots in my bathroom above my shower, they could get a swab sample of what's on their ceiling.
well, yeah, I mean, they certainly can, but here's that. Let me explain to you when you have certain types of growth of mold that look surface related. What we find many times is that there is an issue systemically somewhere in that area that you're not aware of. It could be behind the walls, it could be in the cabinets, and now you're starting to see surface-related mold that's there. You would test that to try to identify what type of mold it is. It may not be the source area of where we're looking for, but it could be what I would consider to be a surface-related type of secondary type of growth from what I call a source area, right? And then the other thing that
so the shower, like somebody's shower ceiling or shower wall in their bathroom, like it's like a small bathroom that gets a lot of humidity because it's in the shower, doesn't have great ventilation. If somebody sees mold growing on the surface of the wall, of the drywall, you would consider that maybe a secondary exposure. You wouldn't think of that as the primary exposure?
Well, here, at the end of the day, you want to look at the visual aspects of what you're seeing. So if you're seeing a lot of degradation in the ceiling where there is actually a breakdown and you're starting to see there's water damage and there's some other things that are there that clearly shows that there is some kind of water intrusions and the breakdown from that condensation that's there, that seriously could be a problem that's above and beyond that area, because the water is actually permeating through and you can't see what's on the top side of that. That may be one area.
But if it's looks like it's surface exposure, right?
Yeah.
They've got green board up, they've got paint on it, the wall looks perfectly stable. It doesn't look like there's water exposure coming through, but it's in a bathroom where it gets a lot of humidity. Is that something that somebody should get overly concerned of? Should they be concerned? Is that something that they should get tested? Or is that something where you should just go in there, hey, we should improve the ventilation here and do some type of surface cleaning to that? Does that necessitate some type of more involved testing?
Well, here's what I would say to you. At the end of the day, certain areas like that are going to be isolated, right? So what you're going to want to do is that you're going to want to start wiping that down. You obviously want to go ahead and do an increase through ventilation, whether it be having an exhaust fan that you bring in there or bring in some type of fan that can help you dry things out in a manner that's going to really not sit there and create the growth of microbes. But my point is that there are times where you may have systemic problems that are in that area that you're not aware of. And when you're seeing that growth, it could be coming from another source area other than that area that's there. And many times what we find is that if it's not in the area that it's in, it's coming from the ventilation system. And so when we open up that ventilation system, we're finding major problems of water damage as well as mold growth that's in these systems that's actually starting to be distributed throughout the home. One key area that we find often when it comes to the distribution from these HVAC systems is when you have mold that starts to grow around the window tracks, because you have the contaminants that are being pushed out, it's settling on the windows, and now that window, because of temperature differentials, could start to condensate and can create the growth of mold. Many people think that the tracks that are dirty is just dirt, but when we test it, most often it's actually mold. And then when we get inside and we start looking at some of these toilet tanks, if you ever take your toilet tank and lift up the top of that lid, and if you see that there's mold that's circulating around and growing on the top of the tank and underneath the lid, that basically is an indication that there could be something going on around that vicinity, or it could be coming from your ventilation system. And we always tell people that you really want to test what you see to determine the types of molds that are there, because you'd be surprised at the type of molds that end up settling throughout. So that kind of gives you an indication of what's being sent out and traversing and settling throughout your home.
Okay, so we've got step one. If you think there's potential for some type of exposure in your house, you're going through that. You're looking at the history. Do I have a history of exposure, water loss? Two, I'm looking for potential, what you call footprints of some type of damage, right? Something that might indicate, hey, there's something going on here. Paper peeling up on my drywall. I've got water stains. I got maybe some mold stains somewhere. Plus, if somebody's potentially symptomatic, more stuffy, more congested, more symptoms when they're in a home versus somewhere else. At some point, they want to do some testing. We talked about the plate testing, maybe not the most accurate. And I think the example that you got with Aspergillus was you could say, hey, it's Aspergillus penicillium. It could be Aspergillus penicillium on the inside as well, but they could be different species. And for the listener, that's like saying I married Joe Smith. Right. But is he Joe Smith from Camden? Is he Joe Smith Jr. from Philadelphia, right? So there could be, even though the first two pieces are the same, and we see this with probiotics as well, Lactobacillus acidophilus, that's not very specific. That's like saying Joe Smith, but then we can look at different identification numbers that tell us down to the species level, and that's more specific. And so I think that's one of the things you were kind of talking about the plates. It gives us an idea of what's outside compared to what's outside, but even what's outside, depending on your environment, could still be problematic to some degree. But the problem with the plates is it's maybe not as specific as it needs to be, and it may not give us as clear a picture because it's just looking for the sediment that's falling. Is that
it's
fair?
not telling you anything other than you see mold growing in a petri dish and it scares the heck out of you, right? And at the end of the day, that's why I always tell people you really want to look for the events, where they originated from, any footprints that are there, and you want to target those, because at the end of the day, it's about removing those manufacturing plants, is what I call those, right? What you really want to keep in mind is that when you're dealing with a mold problem, there's two sources of contamination. You have the physical growth of the mold itself. We talked about sometimes you see it, but most of the time you don't. And then you have the secondary byproducts, the spores, the fragmentation, and these toxins that become airborne. They traverse through the air and then they settle throughout. That's another form of contamination that people are most often overlooking. So when people say that they had somebody come in and they actually did an investigation and they did some testing, what does that mean? Did they actually put air samples up in the middle of a room and compare it to the outdoors? And then the inspection company came back and said, you know what? Your labs are showing the similar types of molds on your home indoors as they are outdoors. And they're saying you have no problem, right? So to me, that's giving people a false sense of security. What you really want to be able to do is really direct yourselves to where these sources are, because you could take, like I said, an air sample in the middle of a room. It's not going to tell you where the problem is.
Well, it's not going to tell you what the problem is, but if to some degree, if they're taking an air sampling and you've got air that's circulating, you got spores that are circulating, isn't it going to give you to some degree of what's in your air? That's one of the things you had said is, hey, once we get this source, this manufacturing site, then that stuff gets into the ventilation system. Now we've got our second source, right? So it could give some information, but it's maybe not the best test to do.
Well, that's like, you know this because you're a doctor, right? You know that the allopathic medical doctors, when they test for certain things, they're using certain panels and you're using certain types of clinical tests, and they're not finding what's going on in the home. So they just can't figure out what's happening. It's because they're not really testing appropriately. And so this is the same thing that happens within the home. When you're in a home, you want to be able to test appropriately, and you want to have the data points to be able to understand what type of microbes are there. And that's that's what differentiates our company from everybody else out there, is that we take the extra step, not to just look at an air sample that's a snapshot in time, which is either a 5-minute pull or maybe 10 minutes, and then compare it to the outdoors. You have to look at all these other factors that
right. So, but that's what I'm trying to get to. So what's the better testing that you recommend people do? Is it the ERMI test or is it something else?
Well, I first of all, there isn't any one test that you can say is the magic test that's going to tell you what's going on. What you have to realize is that you have to really set out a wide net. Like, for example, when you're a doctor, you don't just do one test to determine what's going on with people. You do a series of different things based on what's going on in their body and what you think you can try to uncover, right?
Right. So let's talk about what tests that you recommend for assessing somebody's house for organism exposure, mold exposure, bacteria. What are we talking about?
All right, so the first thing that so let's say we went through the home and we've identified some source areas. We've identified that there's some water damage, could be underneath the kitchen sink, could be maybe in a ceiling in a bedroom area, and so forth. We're going to recommend that we do an air sample inside the ceiling cavity and another air sample underneath inside that cabinetry to determine what type of issues that are there. That's going to tell me if there are molds and if that is the source area. The second thing that we want to do.
So what type of air sampling is that? Because somebody's going, well, you just told me the air sampling with the plates isn't good. What type of air sampling are you doing that's different?
Okay, so what they're doing is more of an ambient air sample. So they're putting it in the middle of a room. What we're suggesting that you do is actually be very targeted and actually put it into a wall. For example, we create a hole about the size of a dime. We stick a tube in there and then we pull the air to see what's going on there to determine if there is a mold issue that's there. Same thing when we're dealing with areas with inside cabinetries and so forth. It's a confined space. It's very targeted. I could do a sample in that confined space, do another sample, let's say, for example, in the middle of that room that it's in, and guess what? Totally different types of results that you're going to get, right? So it's really being very targeted in terms of the areas that you're testing. So when we do air samples, it's very specific, more of a sniper approach in terms of actually going in and identifying certain areas where there's footprints are associated in those areas.
So explain to the people what you're doing with that. You're taking that air sample and you're doing what? You're taking it and running it through what type of testing?
Oh, okay, so we're actually, when we do an air sample, there is what we call a spore trap. I don't know if you've ever seen spore traps before, but the spore trap inside of it has a little slide, and it's a sticky slide. And what we do is that we put it onto a pump, and then we have an extended tube, an extension tube that actually can be put into that hole that we talked about. And then we pull the air maybe for 15 liters, which would be 1 minute or maybe 2 minutes, depending upon what type of area that we're looking at. You want to be careful not to overload the sample, meaning bringing too much airflow in could create debris that's there, which would overshadow it. So it gets onto that slide, and then that slide then is actually labeled in terms of the location of where it's located, and then it's put on a chain of custody, and it's sent to the lab, where the lab opens up that spore trap, and then they take that slide and they put it underneath the microscope, and they actually count the different types of spores that are there, and based on the type of spore structure and so forth, they're able to tell you what kind of mold it's there, but only at the genera level.
Okay, so you're getting a microscopic air sample when you're doing yours versus maybe just throwing a plate in the middle of the room. So you're putting it in a specific area, you're trying to be more targeted, and you're getting a microscopic example. Somebody's taking that, whatever air, whatever spores, whatever's in that air sticks to this sticky slide. You can take it in, then you can take a look at it. All right, so that's part one. That's the next part of the testing. What other type of testing is done?
So when you determine where these source areas are, keep in mind that when you have a mold problem, because of the secondary byproducts that are actually being dispersed into the air, it starts to create a problem overall holistically within your home. So what happens is that these organisms are actually dispersing, and then as they traverse through the air and they settle throughout, they get into your dust. It's the dust reservoirs that are there that actually are harboring all these contaminants. So the more dust that you have in your home, the more accumulation of these types of organisms and their byproducts of toxins that are going to be into your home, as well as it getting into your ventilation system. So what we do then is that we utilize what we call ERMI for the dust, right? You mentioned ERMI, and let me explain ERMI. I'll try to be as brief as I can and do it in layman's terms. It's actually a Swiffer cloth that we use. We go around and we collect the dust throughout the home. And what we're doing is that we're using DNA. And the reason that we use DNA, it's the most sensitive form for detection and identification of the different types of molds and species of molds that are there. So when you use ERMI, they have a panel of 36 molds that are broken up into two groups. Group one being water damaged molds in their species, and then group two are being more the common molds from the outdoors. So what you're able to do now is that you're able, through the collection of that dust throughout your home, be able to analyze not only if you have mold, but the species, because we talked about the species is the key to understanding whether you're having opportunistic or toxigenic types of molds that are there. And so that's what the ERMI is going to tell you. The ERMI, in the way that we use it, we don't tell people to look at the ERMI score. We tell people you want to focus on the organisms and the species that are there, because the scores can be skewed, right? So we want to identify what organism, what species are there. We're going to look at the concentrations of those typical molds that are there, because now we can see if it's in high concentration, those are dominant types of spore equivalents that could be indicating that the source is coming from within. And that is something that you really want to focus your attention on in terms of the concentrations of those species and the capabilities of those species. So that's one area of what we do. We can also test for the mycotoxins. We could test for like 16 different types of mycotoxins. And there's certain mold species, for example, you may or may not be familiar with them, and I don't want to get too technical, but there are Aspergillus niger, Aspergillus ochreus. These are ones that produce ochratoxin A, which you may or may not be familiar.
Yep.
Some of your listeners with ochratoxin A. We have Aspergillus fumigatus, which is another mold that's very concerning because it likes the temperature of the human body. It can actually grow within the human body, and it can create the development and growth of a gliotoxin. And so there's so many different molds and species that are there that are really telling you a story of what is going on within your home. And what we've been able to do is to take that data point and now be able to show people through the species as well as the mycotoxins being in the home. And if it's in the human body, we're saying, you know what? There's a possibility and a likelihood that it could be coming from your home. And that's something that you should be talking to your doctor. And the other thing that we do, we talked a little bit about this earlier, was about the bacteria side, because certain bacteria can grow hand in hand. For example, actinomycetes is actually a bacteria that's a gram-positive bacteria, characteristically very similar to mold. It could sporulate, could put off musty odors, could actually produce biotoxins where the immune response, very similar to that to mold exposure. And it's very common in water damaged buildings. So when we're testing for the actino and we're comparing levels of the actinomycetes at an elevated level, we're showing people that, yeah, not only do you have issues of water damage in your home, but you have other microbes that are growing here that's actually showing you that you have an issue within your home. And we could test for endotoxins, which are part of the gram-negative type of bacteria. And endotoxins could actually wreak havoc on people as well. And these are things that we think are optics, tools that you can basically show your doctor what's in your home, what you're being exposed to, and really make comparisons to the clinicals that you've been actually doing with your doctor to see if there's any type of relationship to what's going on between your health as well as what's going on within your body. Now, we do the same thing with the ventilation system. We could test the ventilation system, and that's one of the things that you want to do as well, because at the end of the day, the ventilation system is the lungs of the home. It's going to perpetually continue to distribute these contaminants and these toxins throughout your home as well. It's really important to identify what's going on within the system too.
Okay, so you're testing the air quality within the home. What else are we doing with the you're testing the air quality in the home in these key areas. You're testing the dust. What are you doing at the HVA system? Are you taking an air sampling within the HVA system? What are you doing within the HVA system to assess it?
Great question. We're actually opening up the systems. We're opening up these systems. We're going to the air handling units. We're looking inside these systems. We're looking to see if there's any kind of rust, any kind of mold growth, any kind of breakdown in the material that's inside there. And many times when we see that there's a mold problem in the home, Dr. B, the ventilation system is actually compromised, and you can visibly see it. And then when you test it, you can start to see that these organisms that were in the home that you've actually found in your dust, now there's a relationship to what we're finding in the dust in the home to what's actually inside the ventilation system as well. We also look inside the returns. We look at the areas of the supplies, and we want to make sure that we test those because we want to see what's going on within those long ducts. You remember I don't know if we talked about that on the podcast or maybe before the podcast. When you're dealing with these duct lines, they're actually very, very difficult because it actually accumulates a lot of dust. The dust harbors these contaminants and their own microenvironment. And so you can have issues of the mold and these other contaminants that can actually start to layer inside there and create problems as you're using the system operationally.
Okay. So somebody gets testing done there. We find that there's a higher concentration of maybe certain types of bacteria that are problematic, maybe certain molds that are potentially problematic. Now, what do they do?
Yeah, well, okay. So here's what we help them with, right? So we're going to basically provide them, we're going to tell them, okay, here's a report. Now we're going to create a report that's a very, very comprehensive report. It's going to outline all the areas of issues with pictures, what the results are from the accredited laboratory, and then we're going to write a work plan for them. We're going to tell them what they need to do to correct the issues that's there. Then we're going to actually look at the ventilation system. We're going to look and see exactly what's inside that ventilation system. We'll be able to let them know based upon the different types of organisms in terms of species, as well as toxins that are there, whether it's something that could be realistically cleaned or not. Now, that in itself could be a problem because when you're dealing with a ventilation system, many people think that they can just clean it and it's going to be okay. But what we're finding out is that you can't really clean these systems effectively because of all the different types of grooves and points that are there. You really have to actually take it and disassemble it and clean it to a point where it's just taking this thing apart. And when you're dealing with flex duct, that's almost impossible to be able to clean these flex ducts because of the different grooves that are there in the system and the long runs that are there. So we'll be able to tell you exactly what's in the system by utilizing the sampling methods that we talked about, the ERMI-like, the mycotoxins, as well as the bacteria. And then we'll give you a recommendation in terms of what we think is going to be the next step. Now,
well, I got to tell you, it doesn't sound good at all from what you just said. If you're saying, hey, these systems are almost impossible to clean, that doesn't bode well for most people because they're not going to take their whole home apart to clean a system. So what are the actual solutions that people, if you're going to come out and give somebody a report and say, hey, all this stuff is here, you're going to have to redo your whole heating and ventilation system and all the ductwork to get rid of the exposure. That's not going to happen. They're not going to be able to sell the house if you do provide a report like that says the place is contaminated, because they have to then put that into their sale information. So what are they to do? Like, what are they going to do? Walk away from their home? I mean, there has to be some solutions to address what we're seeing in a home or in the ductwork. Or, man, why would people aren't going to want to uncover these things?
Yeah. Well, first of all, at the end of the day, knowledge is power. And let me explain what I mean by that, right? So we typically deal with the most sensitive people that you can think of, people that actually are having severe hypersensitivity issues and underlying health issues. And what we talk to them about is that we provide you with data. Now, when you're dealing with your ventilation system, we tell people, look, it really, number one, depends upon your sensitivity level and your ability to have this system cleaned and for it to be acceptable for you. You have three options that you can do. Option number one that we know, and the best option that's going to actually rid yourself from all these different types of contaminants, is to remove it and replace it, right? And we know that it's an expensive proposition to do that, but at the end of the day, that's something, if you want the best solution in terms of being able to have that taken care of, that would be the number one solution to do. Now, option number two is that you could actually clean it, test the efficacy of it, and then incorporate technology that can actually start to capture some of these different types of contaminants and toxins that are coming in. For example, like HEPA filtration with a electromagnetic type of technology that's associated with it, putting in certain types of UV lighting in the system to help ward off the growth of these organisms, and maybe either other types of photocatalytic oxidation devices that cleans and sanitizes the system as it's operationally being used, right? So there are things that you can do from an inline perspective that can actually reduce the cost of remediation and the removal. Obviously, there's no guarantees, but you know what? If you can get it to a point where it's acceptable for people, that's really the level that we want to help them try to achieve. So that would be option number two. Option three would be to clean it and hope for the best.
Right. So if somebody thinks they have an issue, I would say the vast majority of people, I mean, they're going to try and remediate it. And then the most important thing, I think, is what things are we putting in place to reduce or eliminate, I'd say reduce the risk of high exposure again. And those are the systems that you were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And so the key thing that you want to do, Dr. B, number one, is that you want to remove the sources. That's the number one thing, right? You want to remove those manufacturing plants. You want to take those out. You do that through proper remediation. You have a remediation company come in. We do not recommend people bringing in, for example, contractors or handymen to open things up, because the minute you do that, it's just going to create bigger problems. Now the exposure is going to be even more heightened. And what happens is, if you think about it, that disruption is like an atomic bomb going off at the microbial level. I can't tell you how many times we've had people that when they started to bring out a contractor or maybe a handyman and they opened up the walls that were there, their symptoms became so heightened, right? So you want to make sure that you're dealing with the right people that can actually contain it properly and remove it in a manner that is appropriate, because there is a specific protocol that should be done when it becomes to the point of remediation.
So
right?
what should somebody look for if they're looking for somebody who's going to do mold remediation work? What do they need? What should they be looking for?
From that company.
What's the title of the company? Are they going to be, they're going to say, we do mold remediation? How do I know it's not Joe with the truck who does mold remediation? Is there certification? Is there something that they need to be aware of?
Yeah, so great question. The IRCRC, which is the International Institute for Cleaning Restoration Certification, is a organization that actually does training for remediation contractors. They've been around for years. They provide proper certification. You can even go online and you can actually look up to see certain IRCRC certified providers within your area. That being said, you also want to be able to have a conversation with these people. You want to talk with them. You want to find out what is their approach, what is the protocol that they're going to be using, how are they going to be setting these things up. You really want to be able to ask the right questions, and just don't just assume, right, that you bring in a certified guy and he's going to be doing the right thing, right? So you want to be able to make sure through questioning. And we could provide questions for you guys in terms of certain things that you can ask. I could send you a list of questions that you can post if you want for people to have a question and answer that they could do for finding remediation companies. We do have that as a tool that they can use. But that's going to be something that's going to be really important for them to actually try to make sure that they're bringing in the right people to do the remediation.
Okay. And so when somebody comes in to do remediation, let's say we got Stachybotrys, right? And we got a couple other things in the house. What actually needs to be done from a complexity standpoint to truly remediate the mold? Let's say it's mold exposure. I mean, the molds you're talking about, it's in the dust, right? It's going to get in old books. It's going to get into clothing. It's going to be, so how does somebody, when a company's come in, if they just clean your ductwork and clean up the dust, is that enough? Or what happens with clothing, books, the old stuff that grandma gave you that smells like mold and mildew?
Yeah. So, those are things that need to be looked at. When you talk about people who are telling you they come into your practice and they're saying, look, I've had somebody come in and tested, I had somebody do remediation. These are the things that are often overlooked. And it's actually many times it's the settlement of these contaminants that are in their contents. And so, sometimes people have to make tough decisions in terms of the types of contents that they have. So at the end of the day, it's really looking at the contents. And we have a write-up that we can send you on that too, in terms of content cleaning and what you look for and the different things that you can basically do to help clean the contents that are in your home. So, but that's something that certainly needs to be addressed. And as far as the remediation side, as we talked about before, it's critically important to take out those manufacturing plants. You reduced the dust in your home. As you remove that dust, essentially what you're doing, Dr. B, is that you're reducing your fungal, toxic, and microbial load. So the more that you're taking out the dust, the more you're removing these contaminants, and really it's getting your place to be hopefully more acceptable as you continue to do that cleaning. And I will say this, when you do remediation, it's never one and done. It's always about incorporating cleaning regimen that's going to actually need to be done on a weekly basis, And it's something that I tell people all the time. It's a change of lifestyle, right? Many times people have a lot of things in their home in terms of clutter and the way that they live. You have to really understand that when you have a water event, you have to correct that. You have to be aware of the water that's actually going on in your home in terms of moisture issues. But then the clutter that's there, if you have a lot of clutter, you can't realistically see things in terms of problems that are there, and you can't appropriately clean. So it's really eliminating those things that you don't need in your home, being able to extract the dust. And if you do those three things, you're going to get to a place where your home will be what I would consider to be a normal microbiome and hopefully become acceptable for you.
So because we're running out of time here, if somebody, what are kind of maybe 2 or 3 key things that somebody can do just on their own to improve their air quality, right? Their potential exposure that they can do. They don't need you. They don't need me. They can just start saying, okay, these are things that I'm not doing, maybe not doing currently. What are like 3 tips that they can do to start improving their air quality and maybe reducing their organism exposure?
Yeah. So first off, I want to say that if you go to our website, yes, we inspect. We have a myriad of information that is there for people to be able to tap into. We also have other types of services and programs that people can look at. We have people that are online that can help answer any questions and so forth for this particular type of knowledge base that they want to be able to have. And I think that's a great question, because when you think about it, it's about self-advocacy, right? You have to be able to really start to learn the things that need to be done, and you have to take control of being able to find the information that's there. And that's one of the things that we're going to be doing and have been doing in terms of creating different types of programs and different types of information that people can tap into, where they won't even need us to come out. They could do it themselves, because the process itself, in terms of what needs to be done, is going to be the same. Whether we teach you how to do it or whether you have us come in, it's going to be the same, right? So getting back to your question, the answer to that is that you really got to control the moisture. That's the number one thing. If you have moisture issues, the best thing for you to do is to start on the outside of your home. Look to see how the building envelope is actually being protected. If you don't have any gutters, or your downspouts are actually offloading that water directly into your home, odds are you're creating a problem that could be an issue and a systemic issue in your basement or in your crawl space area. If you have sprinklers that are spraying up against the wall, again, this is something that could actually deteriorate and break down the exterior of your home and create water issues and mold growth that can start to develop within your walls. So it's really going around your home, looking at the grading, looking at the way water's flowing, and then coming into your home and then looking at your sources of where your water sources may be. For example, underneath your kitchen sink and the vanity cabinets, be very careful not to overload and store certain things. One of the things that they can do is to get these WeatherTech mats. Are you familiar with the WeatherTech mat? And these sink mats can be inputted into these areas where you have the plumbing in your cabinetry. Could be a great way for them to really protect the material around the cabinets inside there. But again, don't overload those cabinets. Have a plumber come in and take a look at your home in terms of certain areas that could be going on in terms of various areas of your home. And then if you had a water event, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you take a look at the area. And if it's something that you're having a hard time with, then I would bring in a professional and have them take a look at it and do appropriate type of investigation and testing.
So I'll add to, when you're checking your home, I think one of the places that we often don't take a look at because we don't see it is we all have vent pipes that go up to the roof of our house, and they typically have little rubber gaskets that go around them. And as the house gets older, those gaskets start to lose their elasticity, they lose their firmness, and they actually start to sag. And as they start to sag, now they collect water, and now water can get in between the gasket and the pipe and start dripping down into the attic and running down and just following the pipe down to wherever that's going. So it's a thing to keep in mind. So for a lot of people, they never look at their roof unless shingles came off. But this is one of the things, and many times you can take a look, you'll see those little rubber gaskets kind of sticking up. Take a look for it. If not, have somebody go up there and take a look on that. They do go bad. They don't last forever. So that's another place where they could potentially have
absolutely.
A water
and
problem.
The flashing around those points that are actually coming through the rooftop, right? So you got meet points like around the chimney area and so forth. Those are key areas that you want to look at. A lot of that type of membrane starts to break down, just like you're talking about, and could be key entry points in terms of areas where moisture can get into your home.
And I know in our area, there was a time in probably the 90s when stucco was like hot, and some of these builders were putting stucco up, and they didn't really do a great job of putting the kind of flashing and stuff around the windows. And a lot of those homes, that stucco was faulty. Moisture got between the stucco and the home, and that became an area that was problematic as well. I know it's been a bigger issue in the area where I'm at. So we want to check our home, assess our home. What about air? What are other, maybe, is there something, we're talking about dust. People have HVAC units. They've got filters and stuff. What about that? Does putting a filtration system on their home, what type of filtration should they have? How often should they change it? Do you have any insight into that to help them?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a filter itself. A filter is just a Band-Aid, right? So you really want to be able to if you have some hypersensitivity issues, some underlying health issues, my opinion would be is to really go out and do some research on putting an inline system in there that's really going to do a job of capturing these types of contaminants. We talked about HEPA filtration with technology of having the ability to have electromagnetic capabilities, which becomes like a magnet. It pulls those small particles together, so it captures down to a very small level. And that's one of the things that you'll want to try to implement inside there. Same thing with UV lighting, some other types of tools. Those would be key things to do. That being said, at least, once a year, having a guy come out, taking a look at maintaining the system, getting inside there, making sure that the system looks good from a standpoint that there's no issues of any kind of buildup or any type of other growth that you can see. And then we talked about the roofing guy. We talked about the plumber coming out, taking a look at all the points underneath your home. So doing those proactive types of measurements in terms of really trying to get ahead of the game in terms of seeing if there could be any kind of failure, because it's not about a matter of if, it's about a matter of when. And so these are key things. And know that your windows, they have a life period to it, right? Windows can break down, and always look around your windows and look to see if there's any types of delamination or any types of gaps that are there. Same thing with your doors and your thresholds. Those are really big areas where things start to break down.
All right. So I think we'll kind of finish that up. So the big 3 tips maybe is just do a better job of home assessment and maintenance, right? Cleanliness, make sure you're keeping the place cleaner, less cluttered, assessing for any moisture-based damage. And then even from an air quality thing, filtration systems, even though they're a Band-Aid, they're still a way to kind of reduce some of that exposure. And then we talked about the inline systems, the infrared light. Those are the types of things I have and on my house is for those types of systems. And you might want to bring somebody in periodically to check the system out, do a periodic testing. And I think it's good if you get a test done and then you get some form of remediation done. The best test might be the second test, which is, hey, we did the assessment, we did an evaluation, we did a remediation. Sometime down the line, it may not be a bad idea to do a retest to make sure that the things that you found on the first test that were problematic, now that you've done all the remediation, that exposure has now been addressed and cleaned up.
Yeah, and that's a good idea. And I think that, people can, they could do their own ERMIs. We have these dust kits that they can check out in terms of self-testing if they wanted to do. We can, like I said, we have a myriad of different types of do-it-yourself programs that we can help people with. At the end of the day, Dr. B, it's about knowledge. It's about being able to educate. And so we want to be able to help people really have the tools, have the knowledge that's needed to be able to help themselves. Certainly, there's going to be people that need to have more assistance, and that's where we can come in and we can actually do the deep dives, as we call it, and really help them from that perspective. But we have a whole cross segment of different things that we can do to give people the information and the wherewithal for them to be true self-advocates in this area.
Okay. So if people want to learn more about mold and the mold guys, I'll say, where can they go? They
can go to yesweinspect.com. That's yesweinspect.com. Give them a great overview of who we are, what we do, and the different types of programs and services that we can offer them.
Okay. Got it. And is there any other website? Do you have is the Mold Guy?
The Mold Guy is still active. You can go to the Mold Guy. It's still very active. And
is that an old site?
You know what? We just actually merged the companies, and here's the beauty behind what we're doing right now. Is I don't know if I mentioned this. I was primarily California based and really focused in California. Now we're truly a national company, but even more importantly, international, because of the way that we've designed these other programs where we can help people, where people can call in, they can get certain types of assistance and questions that they have. And so at the end of the day, we're going to be able to help you nationally, internationally, and whether it be do it yourself, whether it be having us be guys that can come out to your place to do a deep dive, we're there to help you in any way that we can.
Okay. All right. Well, Mark, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking about what goes on with mold and home and air quality. And so I think we got a lot of information covered, and when the time went fairly quick. So thanks for coming on the podcast. And for the listeners, take some time, look at this. It is not unusual for people to have problems with organism exposure and toxicity. So if you're struggling with chronic health issues, chronic illnesses, this could be an issue. And then you could take the assessment like this. We often do the personal test, right? Antibody testing or other types of organism-based testing or toxicity testing. But this is taking a look at, once we identify that this is an issue, that you may have an antibody exposure, you might have antibodies, you have reactivity, you have toxicity. The next piece is to find the source. And so this is a way to look at the source. Definitely the home environment is the environment you spend the most time. There's limited things you can do in your work environment, and the other environment that maybe potentially may be a source of issue, especially if you're a person who's on the road driving quite a bit, is vehicle issues. So Mark, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Check out their site. What's the site one more time?
It's yesweinspect.com or the moldguyinc.com, the moldguyinc.com or yesweinspect.com. Dr. B, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share our information and the knowledge that we have, and we certainly appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
You too.